Thank you so much for having me today for this seminar. This is work from Polluting to Green Jobs, a seamless transition in the US. We were talking a bit before of how such projects actually are created and how do we even think of topics to cover. So this was part of a work where I was at the US desk at the IMF. We have a country team for each country. There is also a country team for Austria. I was part of the team for the US for 2 years, almost 2 years. And we're now in a situation where Biden was just elected. This is where this project started, and he wants to pass a big legislation on climate supporting measures. In the end, it was the Inflation Reduction Act. At the beginning, it was a different proposal, but all in all, he wants to introduce a lot of climate measures. But he has a very narrow majority, right? So there is one senator, Joe Manchin, that was not in favor of this plan, and that you probably followed this, was often threatening to vote against it, which means the Democrats would not have had a majority to pass it. His argument was, he was the senator of West Virginia. His argument why he was not in favor for a lot of climate regulation was that he thinks that the people in his state, West Virginia, would lose a lot of jobs and they would have to move across the whole country to find new ones. That was his concern. This is a concern we took up. We wanted to see if we do rigorous economic analysis, is it really true that if you put climate measures, be it regulation, in this paper we do regulation, but also R&D or subsidies, which the government ended up doing. Is it really true that people they will lose their job, they have to uproot their lives and move completely across the country? Is this really true based on past evidence? So this is how this question started, and this was part of the 2022 Article 4 report of the IMF, but now became a whole standalone academic project. Obviously, all I just said, and in general, this whole talk, represent my views only and the views of my co-authors, Rui Simano and Ipe Shibata, but not the IMF, its executive board or its management. So I said a little bit, did this? No. Next. Let's see if now it works. Now it works. Okay. So I told you a little bit of how such a project at the IMF is born, how such a research question. But more generally, I think the US back then, and still with the IRA going on right now, and a lot of other governments announced very big green transition packages. And they said that this is an opportunity to create more jobs and better jobs, green jobs. However, as the senator of West Virginia pointed out, there might also be some losers of this transition from polluting to green jobs. And we really need to zoom in to see whether there are potential for winners and losers and how we can avoid this situation. So the three quick questions we want to answer in this presentation is really, what is the distribution across in the US, geography, sectors, and individual characteristic of green polluting jobs? So where are the green jobs, where are the polluting jobs, and who holds them? Second question, this is the most analytical part, I will focus on that in the presentation today, is that what can we learn from the introduction of the biggest environmental regulation that the US has ever experienced, which is the Clean Air Act? What can we learn from that of how environmental regulation affects the labor market? But there we will have its microdata at the plant level, but in a third step, we will actually follow the individual. We will follow the individual person and how they transition from green to polluting jobs, or whether they can even transition. It was an open question to us. I'm going to give you some takeaways right away, and then some of this you will just have to believe, because I can't show you everything in 30 minutes. But I will start by showing that the distribution of jobs, actually, there's a big overlap. It's not the case that all the polluting ones are in West Virginia and all the green ones are in California. They're actually quite distributed. We also find a green wage premium, even controlling for the required skills, for example, that you need for a job, that green jobs pay on average 2% more. Then the second question I told you is about the CAA, which refers to the Clean Air Act, the biggest environmental regulation seen in the US up to date. And we find that it's true when the Clean Air Act affects a specific industry in a specific location, employment in that specific industry and location declines. So it costs jobs, that is true. However, we find that all of these people who lose their job find another job within the same commuting zone. So again, I'm not a labor economist, but I was told commuting zones are the units that we want to look at because this is really what people can move in without uprooting their lives. So long story short, people do lose their job after the regulation. However, they were able to find another job within the same commuting zone and not at a lower wage. They had the same benefits and wage in the new job. Because you might tell me, yes, they lose their job and then they go to another one. But what if they get great benefits in West Virginia doing mining, but then they all have to work at KFC? But that's not the case. They get the same benefits and wage. Yes.
A small clarification question. So the first one refers to compared green wage jobs green jobs are compared to either polluting jobs or neutral jobs or to all jobs.
Yes.
It's always a comparison against polluting
jobs.
Yes,
with both neutral and polluting. Okay. Yes.
So there's this China syndrome literature. No, it's also done at the commuting zone, and then their bad sharks do something else. No, so they have pushed people into longer unemployment, into lower wage occupations, and so on. So why is this here different? Because you think if there's if a plant closes, why does it matter whether the closure comes because of Chinese competition or because of regulation? So why would that generate different adjustment paths?
First of all, in absolute terms, these shocks are smaller. I will tell you about magnitudes in a second, but the shocks are much smaller. It's really often focused on one specific plant within an industry in a commuting zone, and it might not be that many jobs. The other hypothesis, and we didn't look at this, it's a good question, is that the market adjusts. That the market creates new things. For example, imagine all of West Virginia would shut their mining. Maybe they discover new potential for tourism. West Virginia is actually a beautiful state. So this could be one hypothesis why. But it's true. But the magnitude is a different order. But actually, we were inspired by that literature. It's interesting that you say that, the China shock, the famous literature on that. And also, this is where our terminologies of winners and losers comes from, right? Because with financial and trade globalization, we know now exposed there were winners and losers. And with this transition, it's kind of we're ex ante looking, how could we avoid
the group is different, as Stefan said. You compare green to brown jobs and neutral ones. While in the China literature, you have geographical differences in input penetration.
Yeah.
This is a different.
Yeah. But we also find that even commuting zones that have a high concentration of workers in the affected industry, even there, we find that within the same year, there is no significant effect on employment in the whole commuting zone. And the third question is on individual transitions. I find the most interesting part is how likely is it even for a person who has a polluting job to go to a green job? We find it's very unlikely. And we find that green jobs attract a wage increase similar to neutral jobs. So let me quickly say something about the literature. Maybe you've already wondered about how we even define green jobs. How we define green jobs is not us, but Bona et al. This is a seminal paper, but it is an established methodology by Autor et al. I think 3, if I'm not mistaken, of counting tasks. So basically, they have at the occupation level, they count tasks. What is the share of tasks of a certain job, be it a waitress, that are green, and that is the greenest. So we contribute to that literature, but we also contribute to the literature on the effects of environmental policies. And there, we have to say, we found very mixed results. We found some papers saying that regulation is awful for employment. We found some saying it doesn't matter. We found some saying it's actually good because production is optimized. So we're contributing really to answering that question. I think we're enhancing the analysis that is out there in many ways, because the Clean Air Act, since I said it's the biggest regulation in the US, has been used for papers before. However, it was often just a very limited amount, one sector, or one of the paper uses only for states. And we're really trying to look at all the Clean Air Act from the last 20 years. And this is how we contribute. So a short guideline through the talk. I'll talk you a bit through the data, some stylized facts, and then the local market transitions is the effect of the inventory regulation, and then the individual level transactions. And then maybe you're most interested in what we take from this on our policy conclusions. So again, as I said, the green intensity is the ratio of green to total tasks. This is a continuum between 0 and 1. So 0.6 means 60% of the tasks of a specific person is green. And we match that with several data sources on employment within the industry and within the county. Then I'm not going to go into details. It was a very long way to get to actually commuting zone industry employment in the US. And there's some matching done, but I'm happy to talk afterwards if anybody's interested. But this is basically how we get the green. It's the ratio of tasks. Then the pollution-intensive jobs are a bit different. We have polluting industries. This is a 0 or 1, whether an occupation is polluting or not. And occupations are smaller than sectors, and then we weigh how prevalent this occupation is within a sector to get to the sector. This is done. Basically, it's polluting if the industry is in the 95th percentile of pollution intensity for at least the 3 pollutants, CO, VOC, NOx, and SO2, PM10, PM2.5, and lead, which are also the one in question in the Clean Air Act. Also, we find, and other papers find, that these pollution-intensive occupations are 7 times probability of working in a brown industry that we traditionally would consider as brown, such as mining and safety engineering and dredge operators. There's also a paper that I mentioned before, the Blue Dawn paper, the Blue Dawn 2021, that actually shows that it's true that the jobs that we do label as green in the end produce less CO2 than others. So creating the data is a many-step procedure. I think I'm going to skip this again. I'm happy to talk anytime. Just to let you know, the first part of the analysis on the regulation and the stylized fact is done with overall public data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the US, and how we kind of imputed. We went from overall to state sector to county sector and then to commuting zone. But then the last part on the individual transition is from the current population survey, where we really follow individual people switching jobs or coming out of it, unemployment, and going into a green or polluting jobs.
Katharina, for clarification, if there's a marketing manager somewhere in a firm, would that be a green job or a brown job? He could be, or she could be, marketing manager in a factory that does wind turbines, or in a cement factory. Does this matter, or is it the marketing? Is it the occupation that is green per se?
That is an excellent question. So I've had this question last time with someone asking me, well, it's a difference whether the engineer does a solar panel or the engineer builds a mining firm. In that case, I can I can assure you that at the occupation level, these are different occupations. So they would be differentiated. With the marketing director, I would have to look into the data. I'm not so sure. But occupation is a very granular. So there's not just one engineer. There's different types of engineering. So those we would differentiate actually with green between the engineer for solar and the engineer for the mining.
But even if you take a car manufacturer that produces combustion engines, you can have an engineer working on reducing fuel consumption.
Yes.
Would that be a green job?
Yeah.
Or not?
Yeah. So we also had a similar question on EV batteries. So exactly. So that is granular enough. It's granular enough. But yeah, there is a caveat on that some jobs could be within one occupation. Could be whether you're in marketing for a solar firm or maybe in marketing because it's based on the tasks, it would be hard to distinguish. That's definitely a caveat of the data, yeah. But in general, we do see actually this paper by Bludorn and co-authors gives us some security that actually the ones we label as green do create less CO2. So here, this is just how did they evolve over time. The share of green jobs was kind of steady. The share of polluting jobs goes down a bit. The hollow circles are national average. The green are the median for the states. But what you can see is that with green jobs, this is also something we show in the paper. What I wanted to mention here is that within green jobs, there is a lot of variation within industry. So just as you said, within the engineering industry, there is a lot of differentiation on how green the job is, whereas polluting, the variation mainly comes from across industries. So industries, if there's a polluting industry, there's very few green jobs in that industry, but here the variation really comes from within the industries. So this is the map that we showed the US government in our Article 4 consultation in 2022. And we told them, look, there's green jobs all over the place. So in dark green, you see green areas that are higher than 75th percentile of greenness, and the brown are higher than 75th percentile of polluting. And then there's neutral and green polluting. Green polluting means you're in both. You have, because these are separate measures, you have at the same time you're in the highest for green, at the same time you're in the highest for brown. And what I can assure you is that almost 75% of the brown areas, so we would expect that the brown areas will lose the most jobs. About 75% of the brown areas, they border directly a commuting zone that is actually county level. I think this is county level. This is county level. So 75% of the brown areas where you would be worried that a lot of jobs would be lost actually border a zone that is either green or polluting green. And polluting green and green both have about 75th percentile of. So just from looking at this map, you would say that no, it's not the case that if you lose a brown job right here, you necessarily have to go all the way to California to get these jobs. There might be a job here. There might be a job with these brown ones. These brown ones, there might be a job here because these are green and polluting. So obviously there is some concentration of brown and green. I mean, California is very famous for climate transition, but in general, you don't have to cross the whole country to go to a green area. So we also looked at some properties of green jobs, polluting jobs, and neutral jobs. But we looked at, we have a variable with our occupations that say higher skilled, lower skilled, routine, non-routine, urban, and rural. And we see that the green ones, I want you to really focus to compare this green with the polluting. And you can see that here, the higher skilled, the green jobs are, out of all the higher skilled jobs, the share of green is significantly higher than the share of polluting, so they're on average higher skilled. They're also on average higher non-routine jobs, so less manufacturing, electronic dealing, and more maybe engineering, designing, which is traditionally a non-routine job. Also very interesting that in our total of the urban jobs, the green are significantly higher, whereas the rural, where you would expect, for example, the mining and so on, the polluting are higher than the green. So this kind of was a sensibility check for us, but it's, I guess it confirms our intuition. This is the hourly wage premium, where we compare green jobs to neutral and polluting jobs, and we find that even controlling for the hours worked, the hours worked, and also the skills required, and also the work experience required, we find about a 2% wage premium over time for green jobs, which is actually, I was told, but I'm happy if there's labor economists in the room, but I was told that's actually pretty high. So we really have two jobs that require the same profile, but the green one pays 2% more. Apparently that's very high.
Can you do, this is a panel, right? No? Can you do worker fixed effects?
No. This is not at the worker level. This is the job vacancies. Yes. But we have an individual transition at the very end. I'll show that data, but we cannot do a worker fixed effects because it's only a couple of observations per person. Not even in the US that is possible. Not even with the US data. So now this is the main part of the talk. I think the most academic part, which is where we ask that whether environmental regulation can affect the labor market. What I'm talking about is the Clean Air Act. So how does the Clean Air Act work? It's a very historical regulation founded in the 70s, where the government gave the EPA the ability or the duty to monitor national ambient air quality standard. They're called NAAQS, which are basically the amount of pollutants in the air. So what the EPA does is at several points in the country, actually countless points in the country, they have measurements for these 7 pollutants, and they measure whether a county is above that limit that would be allowed. And if it is, what they do is they really look at which firms in that county are actually producing that pollutant, and they will at the plant level assign attainment or non-attainment. So if you don't hear anything from the EPA, you are in attainment, good news. But if you are in non-attainment, it means that you are polluting the air with a specific pollutant under this regulation, and in your county where you're operating, it's now too high. And we look at specific violations of this, of non-attainment, where actually the EPA can penalize you for doing so, for example, by withholding federal funds that are used to build a highway or something. So the EPA can really tell the county, look, you need to get those limits down because you need to be in attainment. And how the counties do it is that they will penalize the individual plants. Yeah.
Is the attainment also made publicly? Is this kind of a negative signal for consumers, workers, or is it just information that goes to the plant and then to the county government?
Exposed, it's public, and that's where I got the data.
Oh,
yes. So the data, I don't know how to pronounce this because I always say ISIS and it's not a great name. ICIS, I guess. ISIS data, which is exactly what you're asking for. It's the cross-section of all firms that have ever been identified as polluters in non-attainment countries. So basically, it's plants that were called, you need to pollute the air less with X pollutant because you are driving the fact that we are in non-attainment. Problem with this is, as you say, there's no time dimension for this. So this is just a list of firms that were ever in non-attainment. So I had no idea what time they were in non-attainment and how did they get out of it. So in order to build a good data set, I needed to know how long they were actually in non-attainment. And what I did is the EPA also published the data set on how individual counties are in non-attainment and from what date to what date. So what I did is I combined these two data sets and I said, I'm making this totally up, no specific firm. This firm, Harry and Peter, I don't know, in Harrison County, Texas. I know that that firm was in non-attainment at some point, and I look when Harrison County in Texas was in non-attainment. And I know that Harrison County, Texas was in non-attainment from 2010 to 2012. So I assigned 2010, 2011 to 2012 to this firm that I'm looking at. So the time dimension I get from the county level data, and the plant information I get from this cross section of plants that were ever affected. And what I do now is then I have to use this, labor economists among you will all know this Eckert et al. Adjustment, how to get the labor data in the US to be at county. Then I do this. But what I do then is I build a panel at the commuting zone time level, because I know how to map counties to commuting zones. And so I know, because of the plant location, that this plant, and because was in non-attainment, this commuting zone industry was in non-attainment for that time, because I know the industry of the plant. Is that somehow clear?
No. So
I agree, it's very complicated.
It's not totally unclear, but is non-attainment something defined at the county level?
It's at the plant level.
Plant level.
Yeah.
But
because you might, for example, you might be a doctor's office, your county might be non-attainment, but the EPA is not going to call you.
Okay, so you assign it to the plant level. The EPA says the county is in non-attainment.
Exactly, and they say to the county, you better do something about it, otherwise I withhold all your federal funds, for example. Exactly. So what the county then does is to see which plants are actually using that pollutant. Those are very different pollutants, I learned. Also did not know that. But you know which ones are your plants producing that pollutant. So you call that plant and you say, you are in non-attainment. You need to lower your pollution of that pollutant by X%. And then...
But you don't have this information. You don't know the orders of the counties.
I just know that the county has identified this specific firm. That I know.
That you do know. Okay.
Yes. And what they will tell them is to reduce the pollution. Then there is no doubt. By how many % is not clear. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I combine with this county level data to see what time this firm was actually affected. And because I know where the firm sits, in which commuting zone and what industry it is, I can now have a panel at the commuting zone time level.
Mm-hmm.
But then still, how do I create this shock at the commuting zone time level? That's the question. And what I do is I have a commuting zone time and industry. So the shock is at, this is location, commuting zone, industry, and time. And I say, there is a dummy that is 1 if this commuting zone industry time is in non-attainment. If there's at least one firm in that commuting zone industry time observation that is in non-attainment, and then I weigh this by how many people actually work there. Yeah, that is the weighting. Yeah, because we do these local projections, I'll show in a second, we take T+2. Because we want to relate it to the change in T-1 and T plus H. So this is the shock now we have, which is just a dummy whether at least one firm is affected and how many people actually work there. And the specification is very simple. So I take a classic Yorda et al. Local projections specification, and on the left-hand side, I put the log of employment, the number of establishments, and the log of average payroll from T-1 to a horizon T plus H. So it will be a local projection. And on the right-hand side, I will have this shock that is at the commuting zone industry time level. And then the trick about our identification, I guess, is that we have here commuting zone time fixed effects, so that we can really identify the causal effect of the Clean Air Act by controlling for unobserved sector and time. and commuting zone time characteristics. So here we have sector time and commuting zone time in case there was some locational or industry specific unobserved things going on that we're not picking up. Because this might be your biggest concern, right? That there's something going on in this industry, it's booming, and because it's booming, I don't find any effects on the employment because it's booming anyway, and I don't have really a good counterfactual. However, we have industry time fixed effects that would pick this up. Same with a geography. If you say that commuting zone at the moment is booming for X, Y reason, so you're not going to find negative effects on employment, but we have commuting zone time fixed effects.
So remind me, is the commuting zone collects several counties?
Yes, there is a mapping though.
The commuting zone is larger than the counties are.
Yes, that there is a mapping though that the BLS requires.
Run this entire thing at the county level? That
was my point. Labor economists told me you don't do this, but for what we're trying to answer, the question whether people need to uproot their lives after they lose the job to environmental regulation is the commuting zone. Because you know how many in a DMV, we just talked a bit before that kind of like DC is the southern part of Maryland and then DC and the northern part of Virginia. There's a lot of counties in that. And it wouldn't be informative to tell you that.
Yeah, but you could have commuting zone fixed effects on the right side. You can't allow for whatever sort of clustering in the air terms. Right?
Yeah, but what I'm going to show you, so what the trick is that, or I guess one of the identification tricks is that I find that employment in the commuting zone sector does go down, but it doesn't in the overall commuting zone. If I did that at the county level, I would tell you, well, employment at the county, let's say we talked about Anacostia County before, which is a tiny part of DC, does go down in the industry and location level, but also in the whole location. But maybe somebody only needs to travel 5 minutes to get to the next county. I think that is the idea. So that we might get results that don't really represent whether people have to move or not, I guess. Yeah.
Question, is commuting zone defined by some travel distance time, like 2 hour? I don't know what's
No, it's less. But yeah, the Americans, we talked about this before, have a much higher openness to commute. But I'm not sure entirely, but it's defined by the.
The question is that if you are living in a commuting zone, but you're actually working across the border from the commuting zone, how is that captured in the data?
No, you would be in the commuting zone. These are jobs. These are about where the job is located.
Yeah. Zone is defined based on the location of the
job. Yes.
Job.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess your worry is if you live on the northern border and then your job is just inside the border, but then your new job is at the south, it's a much longer commute. Yeah. I cannot tell you whether you will have a longer commute or not, but you will be. All I'm assuming is if you're fine with working at some point in this commuting zone before the regulation, you're also fine with working in another part of the commuting zone after the regulation. I see your point that it's a bit of a stretch if you're at an extreme, but these are average effects, I guess. We start our clustered arrows at the sector level, which is probably obvious. So first regression we do is left-hand side here, we have log of employment at the commuting zone industry time level. And here we have the shock, very plain vanilla regression. And what you can see that there is a negative effect. Once the shock hits, there is a decline in that commuting zone industry in employment. So there's no way to sugarcoat this. In terms of magnitudes, so let's see 2 years here. This is approximately 2.7%, 0.027. So in magnitudes, this means if 100% of all jobs in one commuting zone industry were affected by the shock, then employment would decrease by 2.7%. However, in reality, never 100% are affected, only a part. And weighted by average employment, to just give higher weight to the bigger ones, we find the same. We also now wanted to see, because we have this nice data on green and polluting jobs, whether actually the jobs that we lose are polluting and the ones we gain are green. And it seems that this is the case. We introduce an interaction of the shock with a variable where whether this commuting zone industry time observation is above median for greenness. And we see that once the shock hits, green jobs increase and polluting jobs decrease. This was a nice finding, also a nice sensibility test. It really looks that I think anecdotal evidence also from talking to firms tells us that often when they're then called by the county and said, dude, you need to reduce the pollutions for this because you are causing the whole country to be above the limits, then often what they do is hiring environmental specialists to improve this for them to get attainment again. But at the same time, they're also firing the occupations or not replacing. I know I have to be much more careful if labor economists are in the room. I'm not differentiating between job destruction or where we're just saying towards the counterfactual of employment. But now I told you that bad news, the regulation actually kills jobs in some way in a given affected commuting zone industry. But then the big question is, do people find a job within the same commuting zone? And for that, there's an easy trick. You just run the very same regression, just leaving out the industry component. You see how affected is this commuting zone just overall, not at the industry, and you see how is the employment in the overall commuting zone, and you see that none of this is significant. So even when there's a large shock to a commuting zone, big caveat, my data is annual, but within the same year, even for commuting zones that were highly affected by the regulation, we do not see a decrease in employment. So this is what made
you don't know whether those who lose their jobs find employment elsewhere. This could be a result of migration, for example. Not that
on average.
Yeah. So the green workers are moving into the commuting zone. The brown workers remain unemployed, but employment is stable because of immigration of green workers into the commuting zone. Can that be?
Yeah. And we're also, yes, and we're also not taking a stance on whether you like your new job and whether this is a good point, especially in what I'm going to say subsequently, that it's actually hard to go from polluting to green. So this makes sense. Yeah.
The y-axis is all zeros here.
Yeah, it's very small. Sorry, I should have put more decimals on my axis. Sorry. So the number of establishments, I also wanted to know whether actually plants are closing in response to this shock. So because there's two different scenarios. The county calls the firm and says you are in non-attainment and you need to reduce your pollution. There's two versions in some way. So the theory, conceptually, what we're thinking of is this firm is going to deviate from their optimal production function and needs to shed workers. That's the conceptual basis we operate on. The other option is obviously they could close the whole plant, right? I mean, they're in non-attainment, they need to do something about it. They could close the whole plant. We don't see this in the non-weighted regressions. We do not see that the number of establishments goes significantly down after there is a regulation shock. However, this is a bit interesting when we weight by average employment. So the big firms, you can think of this as the big firms being weighed more. You do see a decrease, and that is the result of the fact that this is at the plant level. So I'm not imagining you have a coffee shop from Seattle and you have 10 of those coffee shops in your city. You have the ability to actually close 1 out of 10. However, if you're a mom and pop shop and this is your only opening, you're probably less likely to close your whole business. However, the large operations, they have the ability to fine tune after such shocks and say, well, we can close 1 out of 10 establishments. And this is the result. But overall, if you do not weight this, then you do not find an effect on number of establishments.
Can you differentiate between green and brown establishments?
No, because we don't know what the occupations are relating to the establishments. For that, the coffee shop from Seattle would need to give me we have that many baristas, that many cleaners, that we know. That would be very interesting, yes.
Katharina,
Yes.
can you come to me, please?
Yes. So the last thing I'm going to say is now you might tell me that these people, it's all good and well that they lost their jobs and then they found another one. But how about that this is the worst job ever? And I cannot tell you about interesting jobs and non-interesting jobs. What I can measure is wage and benefits, which is a variable we have. So which is a great variable in the US to have, because it's a big difference between your wage and if you get, for example, healthcare and all other things. Because the idea was that was also an argument from the political side, was that if the mining workers, they had great benefits, if they all lose their jobs and then they all work well in the same commuting zone, but in a fast food restaurant, they might get paid much less and the benefits might be much worse. But we do not find that. So at the sector commuting zone level, we find no effect on the page, and we find no effect at the commuting zone level. So from the third part, I'm just going to show one slide and then I'm going to skip the rest. And this is a bit related to what Gabriel was asking about, is how likely is it actual to go from a green and polluting job? And it's not that likely. So here we show moving from polluting to a green job. The probability is the highest to move to a green job when you've actually been at a green job before. And this is using the data on the individuals. Okay, so I ran out of time. I guess the last thing on policy implications, I'm not going to repeat all the findings again, but the last thing on policy implications I want to say, which is related to what Gabriel pointed out with the China shock literature, which is really what also inspired us a bit with this analysis, is that, it could still be, as you've been pointing out during this presentation, that people lose a job they actually like and they have a hard time transitioning, or it's people do end up unemployed, but new people come in. And there might actually be small pockets where people lose their jobs and they might also need retraining, because we know that green jobs require higher training. So policymakers have to be very aware of what the structure in their commuting zone is. If regulation will hit a certain type of jobs, there might be a need for intervention to help these specific, let's say, losers of the transition to get on the right track, to go with the transition and find a green or a neutral job. Thanks so much.
Excellent.
Discussion is open. May I ask for comment, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting talk and very interesting project. Maybe could you elaborate a little bit on the intuition of why we should observe these changes in supply, demand for green jobs and supplies and equilibrium as a consequence of the shock? So I wasn't sure about what's the argument why we should observe these effects, about the hypotheses. So I was also thinking about, you mentioned this, that there are incentives to hire environmental specialists, for instance. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, and related to that, it would maybe also interesting to make use of the variation of penalties. I think you mentioned penalties that come from the governments to the firms and say, if you don't change your pollution, then we sanction you. So maybe this could be an option of identifying policy effects. So these are my two questions.
Should I answer right away, or do we?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So first question. Yes, one hypothesis is why if if a firm is hit with this, or let's say a commuting zone time industry is hit with this shock, why would they employ more green and less brown? There's two hypotheses. The first one is they have to maybe give up the part of their production that is most polluting. Maybe it is a firm that produces paper, and one type of paper that is bleached causes all the pollution. Imagine that. So what they're closing is just the part of the branch that produces the bleached paper. And that's why we're shedding polluting. Why we are gaining green, our hypothesis is actually that we're hiring environmental specialists. And this is not just anecdotal evidence. What we see a lot after units are affected by the shock, we see that even when it's a mining, or even when it's a mining sector or something, we see green occupations going up. And actually one referee pointed this out to us and said to us, why would you see after the commuting zone X mining sector, whatever is hit, it employs a lot of green jobs. It makes no sense for green jobs to be in the mining sector. But then we said, no, this is actually what's happening. The mining is hiring people in order to see how they can minimize pollution. The second thing, the second on penalization, it's a bit more complicated because of this system, how it works, with the House and the senators and the congressmen, and how the power is distributed, is that government gave the EPA this power, and the EPA, they actually sanction the whole county for being non-attaining. And then it's the county's responsibility to find the plants.
So it won't be difficult to do, like, the higher the sanction, the higher.
We don't know about the height of the sanction.
Okay, that's not.
All we know is there's different forms of non-attainment. For example, the most common is a Title V permit. There's different forms of non-attainments, and there's some forms of non-attainments that come with sanctions, and we're only looking at the ones that come with sanctions. But I don't know how high they are. And they can be everything. And it's also situational. For example, again, like we had an example where we knew this county was building a highway, and the threat was to withhold federal funds for that highway. But it could be in a situation where you're not building a highway, you don't want the highway in your county. It might be another threat, but we don't have data on that yet.
So a question on the empirical strategy a bit. So you didn't really show the parallel trends
Yes, we did. Yes, there's no pre-trends.
Okay. And what's the model? Is it like a 2F fixed effects kind of model, or what's the core estimation?
I mean, it's a quasi difference in difference, right?
Okay.
In a sense that you have that you're looking within the same. You're looking because the shock is already by how much you can think of a shift share, in a sense that the shock is already considering how much employment is affected. And that's kind of given. We take that as given.
So my question is, are the shocks happening at the same time, or are they staggered, given the new literature difference? And the second is, what's the counterfactual? What's the counterfactual unit you're comparing with?
Yeah, we're comparing it with it's a continuum. I mean, the shock is the combination of the dummy with the affectedness, right? How many people work there?
Yes.
So that's kind of the shift share. But the counterfactual is a county that is 0% affected, and that exists.
Okay.
Yes. So out of the 625 in those 25 years, out of the 625 commuting zone, 420 were at some point affected. We also have a robustness where we take out those that were never affected. And the diff in diff is also done without those that are never affected. The pre-trend test is also done without those that were never affected. You might have been our referee number 2.
I can see what the questions might have arisen refereeing this paper, yes.
Yes.
I also have a question, and it relates to the comparability of the CAA to the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't know whether I'm correct, but if this Clean Air Act is targeting specific pollutants, And I guess it's easy to remove the pollutants by installing a filter or something like this in a plant, rather than to close down the plant. So the capital expenditure is rather small if you want to remove your plant from or your county from the EPA list. And the question is whether this Inflation Reduction Act has a quite different operation on the plant level. I mean, if it's to reduce CO2 emissions, for example, this is something you cannot do with a filter. You need a completely new technology, which is rather capital intensive compared to installing a filter. So do you think this has some implications for you?
Yeah, so I mean, first, the Inflation Reduction Act is hardly comparable because it includes only very little regulation and a lot of subsidies. And yeah, because the Biden administration promised that there will not be any tax increases for people below, I think, was it 400,000 yearly income? The worry was that regulation would be passed on to the customer, and that's why it wasn't done. So the Inflation Reduction Act is mainly subsidies and not regulation. So we have a little connect there. But the second thing you're asking, I mean, I know America is not the land of the crazy anymore, in a sense that filters have already been installed. So there's already strict regulation on what you have to do and on the filters that you have to have and so on. But of course, if you're producing too much of that bleach paper, you might still outpass the limit that you're allowed, right? Even if you have the filter, if you produce a lot. And that's more what's happening, in a sense that I guess this is beyond just adjusting capital. But you're right, because I mentioned the conceptual framework that we're coming from. It is the following, that by having a commuting zone industry affected, you kind of tell them you cannot do your optimized production function anymore. You have to deviate. And this can be both. It can be both adjusting human capital and adjusting hard capital. And the hard capital, maybe the Inflation Reduction Act, and that closes the loop, I guess, might be a good way, because there's mainly subsidies in there. And we have a very nice paper, the same co-author, Rui and me, and Philip Barrett and Sean Chateau, who are two excellent theorists. This is the only theory paper I ever wrote, where we use the Inflation Reduction Act and, well, what Biden first proposed, which was not yet Cost of Reduction Act, but we compare the climate agenda for the US. What would happen if the US put a carbon tax versus regulation versus subsidies? And we find that the carbon tax is by far the dominant strategy for the overall macroeconomy. We have a sectoral level, one with endogenous technology, fuel sizes, and we see that the carbon tax is the best. Subsidies are very heavy on the fiscal budget and are not as effective, but that's what the administration decided to go with.
Also in terms of employment and unemployment.
Yes, we look at employment. We look at the whole macroeconomy. There's two models in the paper. One is sectoral. One is focused on this endogenous fuel technology improvements. And we see that for the whole economy, the carbon tax is the most efficient way to get down CO2 and also for the macroeconomy more generally, which also goes, if the state has more income through the carbon tax, it can also spend on subsidies and stuff.
Thanks for telling.
Thank you so much. Yeah. That maybe gives you that paper maybe gives you a better, because here we are very focused, you're right, we don't really relate to the Inflation Reduction Act because it's mainly subsidies, yeah.
Then a small remark. I was a bit puzzled about the location of commuting zones and counties. So a commuting zone is a fixed area.
Yes.
But what happens if a plant is located at the border of the commuting zone? So you would have just a few miles into another commuting zone, but because it's at the border, it's just a short trip. Would you think your results change if you work with kind of flexible commuting zones that are located in a circle around the plant that is affected.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
You give all the counties one that are close to the plant in commuting distance. Instead of analyzing the commuting zone within the firm where the firm is located.
So this very much relates to your question. Yes. That is a good point. The only thing I want to say is that not the whole US is covered in commuting zones. There is parts of the middle of nowhere where there is no commuting zone in question. So it's mainly around the big cities, the commuting zones. But yeah, that is definitely a critique on our assumption that I said that we assume that if you're happy to commute to one point in the commuting zone, you're also happy to commute to others. But if you live on the extreme, then of course it's different. Yeah. I don't know which way this would bias our estimation though.
No, but can I say something on this? If you have point locations of the facilities, right, you can create what are called isoclines. So in a remote county, a 1 hour isocline would be a much larger commuting area than in a city. So,
but I don't know where the person lives.
That doesn't matter, right? That doesn't matter. You can say, for this facility, let's do a 2 hour isocline, which is what, given the road network and transport infrastructure, what would a 2 hour journey imply? As a robustness check, right? You can have a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, whatever. And then this is the point, right? So most likely, ideally you should have origin destination data. This household switched from this job to this job, increasing the commuting time from X to Y, right? But what Thomas said, using predefined commuting zones, where you could be really on the boundary of it, can lead to, maybe you get even more significant results.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah. So I see your point, and I know that the assumption I'm making is quite big, but I don't see how it would drive our results. Yeah. Maybe actually, yeah, as you say, I might get even more.
Yeah, but look at the isoclines. If you're using R or Python, you can calculate them very easily.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have the location of the household that's going to the job.
No, that's the problem.
Yeah.
But I would assume I have to make the same assumption. I don't know where the person lives. I only know where the job is. Mm-hmm. But I would assume if they're happy to commute to X firm, they're also happy to commute to everything that is 1 hour from X firm. Yeah, that is maybe that's more reasonable than, yeah. Because I do see it. I see our own commuting zone. It's quite big. Just because you're willing to go to Southern Maryland, you're not maybe willing to go to Northern Virginia.
My family in New Jersey, they drive 1 to 2 hours every day. That's considered normal.
Yeah, I think Jersey City is within the commuting zone of New York City. So a commuting zone cannot just cross county lines; it can even cross state lines. Yeah.
Okay, I don't have any more questions in the Teams channel and also not in the room. So I thank Katharina very much for her presentations and all the participants in the discussion.